So the first one wasn't posed directly to us, but was kind of tossed out by BearDaBeast, who's the franchise point guard for T-Wolves Gaming, Finals MVP in 2019, a long tenured player in the league, and one of the large faces of the league. So he put out a question, namely, how does everyone from Zero Gaming not get drafted? And to give you a little backstory, just in case you're new to the league scene, Zero Gaming was a very cohesive team of pro-am players, so playing amateur tournaments in these 5-on-5 game modes, who played really well together and stayed together throughout the whole year, which is fairly uncommon in the pre-draft, in the time before the draft, off season. They won a lot of money together, and not all of their players got picked. So Bear is, asking seriously, how is it the case that in this draft class, or in this draft rather, where there were 47 slots, how do all of their players not get picked? Len, how did it happen?
I mean, I guess on paper, the easy way to put it is, I would have just assumed that, I ended up making a tweet. I think it was the night before the draft, in which it was pretty much talking about perception and preference, and just pretty much going into the draft, having the confidence that you were genuinely yourself, and beyond that, there's not really much you can control. At the end of the day, each team in which they scout looks at many different qualities, right? Depending upon the interview phase, depending upon gameplay, and potentially uh, style of play in which you're playing on retail. There's different, offensive formats in which teams play on, whether it be 5 out, pick and roll. There's different builds. Point guards and centers and locks and things of that sort could play on. In specific, Zero Gaming had a center who, for some odd reason, everyone seemed to have been reprimanding, in a sense, it being a 7'3" center. It's considered more of an exploit build, et cetera, et cetera. But considering all these things, uh, we sort of get to a point where it comes down to preference, and it's unfortunate because I think early on in the process, the sort of selling point or mantra of being scouted for the 2K League was pretty much get results in Pro-Am, and you'll find yourself in a good spot. And it's sort of, you're getting into this murky area now where we're 6 years into this process now. This is our sixth year of scouting and preparing for drafts, and you're seeing more and more now teams sort of adapting different mentalities to how players are specifically picked. Um, it's really interesting because within all of it, again, like I said, there's perception. I think when you look at a player like Tay, for instance, the point guard for Zero Gaming, I think there was a couple of other guards that I think comparatively I wouldn't mind saying he's better than, and so totally taking out the results and in-person performances and overall landscape of what retail pro-am it is, and what Zero Gaming was to retail pro-am this pre-draft. Um, I think just his skill set also on the table, it can match up with some of these other point guards. So it does become a bit of a head scratcher in the sense of, why is there a preference for potentially other guards than him? And I think that's more so the question I ask myself, as opposed to how did he not get drafted. I think when you look at how did a player like Willow or Tay not get drafted, I think, perception is a damning thing in this league at times, and
Yeah,
narratives, and I think they just have caught themselves on the sort of wrong side of that spectrum, as we saw even with a player like Seldom last year, and
yeah,
so I think that's more so what I'd pinpoint.
yeah. It's really tricky because, again, there are certainly a lot of capable pro-am players, in the world, in simply North American pro-am and beyond, and there are only 47 slots at the end of the day, and so the math is simply not your friend ever. And even the pool finished at, I think, exactly 200 players, after they made some final day um, trims to the actual pool. That's still, an unweighted chance of below 25% to make it. And once you start to factor in, all right, people who are going to get drafted, like a Glizzy or Greens or Spam who went top 3 in that order. Right, once you start to filter out the guys you know who are going to get drafted, right, then it becomes very, very tricky and very, very particular, and you start to have to look at individual teams to see what fits are provided there. And so it's a valid question from Bear, in the sense that, these are guys who performed very well in prime and unfortunately went undrafted. And every year you can point to snubs, because there are always going to be snubs. And the funny thing is, if those snubs, and we can rightfully call them snubs, if those guys had gotten drafted this year, let's say that forces out, another 10 players, right? We might have turned around and said, how did those guys not get drafted? So it's just a really mathematically unfavorable proposition. And what it does is it puts it down sometimes to individual teams. And that's where the preference catch is, because there's this terminology of a 50-50 pick floating around. And it's true. Like, some guys are considered 50-50 picks, but that's not really an accurate bit of terminology for them. It's more of a scenario guys, and scenario fits, right? In one scenario, if this happens or if that happens, right, the draft plan looks a bit different for any team. So I think it's an unfortunate situation. It's a tough situation. But it's really nothing new this year, because there are always going to be snubs, and there are always going to be guys who get picked because teams think they fit them better. It's just how it works with relatively little roster flexibility, in the sense of you have 5 guys on the roster, and all 5 guys on the roster have to play. That means there are only 125 spots in the pool, which means you walk out with like 78 people on rosters to begin with out of 125 coming into the pre-draft process. The numbers are just bad, and when the numbers are just bad, it automatically means that there are going to be some snubs.
Well, and I think you had brought up an interesting point too, that maybe us being on this side of things, potentially have more awareness about, and in which how we watch the draft sort of go and how we predict the draft is going to go. I look at specific picks within the draft that potentially a player like Tay was considered, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or even there was a point where even like a player like Mooch, who was another guard who has been, sort of having his ups and downs. He went undrafted last year, was a part of the league bench last year to sort of counter that. And then he came in, and I think early on he was considered like a definitive sort of lottery guy, and he slipped out of the lottery again. And you saw
Yeah.
that instance again where it's like, okay, none of these teams need point guards anymore. And a team ended up, moving a player who was predicted to be a guard, just an overall guard in general for them, and move him to center and seam. And the Raptors did that, and that made them able to bring in a player like Seam at the point guard position, or like Mooch at the point guard position. If that didn't happen, similar to Tay, no other teams were needing point guards beyond that. I think the Jazz did. But there's no telling what the preference would have been at that pick either. And so
Yeah.
obviously they went with the player who was more 3v3 oriented. Both Mooch and Tay are more so 5v5 guards. Not to say they can't play threes, but it's just more so their MO. And I think that's just the sort of tough part. There's even players like, Glowski, who it started to get to that point again where it's like he went undrafted last year,
Yeah.
and now it's on those last couple teams to take a swing. Obviously, my team, we had the 43rd overall out of 47 picks, and it got to that point for us where it's kind of like, man, you have a late pick and you come in and you're preparing more so to hope a guy falls, and next thing you know, it's like, damn, there's like 2, 3, 4 guys, and you're kind of having to decide between a
Yeah.
plethora of guys as opposed to hoping the guy falls to you. And
Yeah.
so,
It's always guys who fall, because, right, even if you just had a very basic top of the draft, where everyone in the lottery even was, going according to plan, the lottery is basically 30% of the overall draft, right? So once you're through that, or if you have a couple, surprise picks up in the top there, then all of a sudden people fall, and this has happened, consistently in terms of guys falling, and you've been the beneficiary of that, in years past, where there have
yeah,
been guys, who are maybe supposed to go in the top 11 who fell to you at 43.
yeah.
it really is tough and it really is unfortunate. And I hope that the guys who didn't get drafted this year just continue to work on the game and don't feel like accurately try and estimate what they could have done better, if anything. And if they couldn't have done anything better, just keep putting in the work, because it'll eventually pay off, right? Ideally, you look at a guy like Glowski or a Logic Stark. These are guys who went undrafted in past years and just kept working and either changed up the narrative on themselves or were so impressive with the work that they put in that that their persistence and perseverance paid off in the end.
Well, and I think that's a big.
Yeah, go ahead.
I
Go
just
ahead.
want to say one more thing. I think that's a big thing as far as, like I said early on, the mantra was more so win, win, win. And yeah, I think winning is important, but as we're seeing more and more
There's so much to
in-person
win these
events,
days, though.
well,
There's
that
so
as
much
well.
more to
Yeah,
win, and that devalues winning.
yeah,
Until the in-person events, which obviously matter more than the Hoff OVNs
yeah.
or whatever overnight tournament you might have.
Well, and that's why even within these in-person events, or do you even just online, just the networking aspect I think is so huge now too. Bless you.
Excuse me.
Yeah,
It
no
really
worries.
is on stage. That
Yeah,
that sneeze came out absolutely nowhere.
yeah,
Totally is.
exactly. Yeah. But yeah, so I think it's just considering all facets, because on our end it's the same thing. It's not just one definitive thing. I'm not just picking a player just because they have favorable results in a version of the game that we're not necessarily playing. There's so many
Yeah.
different facets of it, and I think as more and more coaches are gaining more and more experience throughout the years after they've taken swings on certain personalities and things of that sort, it's just deeper than the game at some point.
Yeah,
And so,
it really is.
yeah.
Absolutely. And just for me to finish off, like the absolute toughest thing about this process is the relationships you build with prospects through interviews and through watching them over the course of a pre-draft. And it's tough
Yeah.
because you see a lot of your favorites get drafted by other teams or go undrafted. And it's not an easy thing, even on it, right? We're not just coldly sitting here, saying, all right, this player is terrible, he won't get drafted. No, we actually do try and build relationships, and it's unfortunate when you're not able to see as many people as you'd like get drafted.